In June 1462, Sultan Mehmed II saw a terrifying sight: thousands of Turkish prisoners impaled on stakes. This horrific demonstration forever gave the Wallachian ruler Vlad III the nickname Teps, the Impaler. For centuries later, the ruler, already known as Dracula, became one of the most recognizable figures in world culture, and myths about him spread far beyond the borders of his native Wallachia. Vlad Teps, History and Legends about Dracula. He ruled for only a few years, but left a mark on history that overshadowed the deeds of many great monarchs. His name is overgrown with so many legends that it is sometimes difficult to separate truth from fiction. In the German lands, he was considered a mad tyrant. The Russians saw him as a cruel but fair ruler, the Turks a dangerous and treacherous enemy, and the Romanians a national hero, a defender from Ottoman rule. Modern researchers still argue about whether Vlad III was really a pathologically cruel ruler or whether his image was distorted by medieval propaganda. Especially many myths appeared after his confrontation with the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, when European chroniclers, shocked by the news of the Forest of Stakes, began to create the most incredible stories about the Wallachian Hospodar. Since then, each era has added new features to the portrait of Dracula, until the real historical figure turned into a cultural phenomenon of global scale. How did the son of a small Wallachian prince become one of the most famous historical figures? And where is the border between the real Vlad III and the mythical Dracula? German stories. In 1463, a small pamphlet was published in Vienna that forever changed the Europeans' perception of the Wallachian Hospodar. The unnamed author described Vlad III as an unprecedented villain and maniac who enjoyed the sight of human suffering. Over the next 40 years, the pamphlet was reprinted 14 times, an incredible circulation for the 15th century. German stories painted a terrifying picture. Dracula invited beggars to a feast and burned them alive to save them from suffering. He nailed turbans to the heads of Turkish ambassadors who refused to take off their headdresses. He liked to have breakfast among a forest of stakes with dying victims. He buried alive monks who gave poor answers to theological questions. The pamphlet paid special attention to Vlad's conflicts with the Transylvanian Saxons, German colonists from the cities of Brasov and Sibiu. The author explained the reason for their feud solely by the bloodthirstiness of the Wallachian ruler, keeping silent about the political and economic contradictions between Wallachia and the Saxon cities. Soon after the pamphlet appeared, the German poet Michael Beheim wrote a poem about the villain who was called Dracula and was the voivode of Wallachia. In it, the image of Vlad acquired even more demonic features. He appeared as the most evil beast of all time, the most ferocious of rulers. Beheim's poem finally cemented Vlad III's reputation as a mad tyrant in the Western European tradition. Russian legends. A completely different image of Vlad III was created by the Russian diplomat Fyodor Kurutzin in the tale of Dracula the Voivode. Having visited the court of the Hungarian king Matthias Corvinus in 1482, Kurutzin met with people who personally knew the Wallachian ruler. Unlike the German authors, Kurutzin portrayed Vlad as a stern but fair ruler who sought to establish order in his country. The famous story about the golden cup placed by the well for travelers in the tale serves as proof that the ruler was able to eradicate theft in his lands. No one dared to take the cup, fearing punishment. Even the most brutal acts of Dracula are explained by the Russian author as state necessity. The mass execution of the boyars is presented as fair retribution for traitors. The massacre of the beggars is presented as ridding the country of parasites. The story of how Vlad tested a merchant by putting an extra coin in his purse demonstrates the wisdom of a ruler who understood human nature. The episode of Vlad's conversation with the Hungarian ambassador, which is absent from German sources, is especially interesting. When the ambassador refused to take off his hat, citing the custom of his country, Dracula did not nail it down, but praised him for his loyalty to tradition. This story shows the Wallachian ruler as a subtle diplomat who respected foreign customs, the complete opposite of the image of a mad tyrant from a German pamphlet. The tale of Dracula the Voivode was widely distributed in Rus. More than 20 copies of this work are known, created from the 15th to the 17th centuries. The Russian tradition of perceiving Vlad III as a cruel but fair ruler influenced the formation of the image of an ideal monarch in Russian political culture. Turkish legends. In Ottoman historiography, Vlad III received the nickname Kazakli Voivode, Voivode Impaler. Turkish chroniclers, describing his deeds, did not hide their horror and admiration for this dangerous enemy. They were especially struck by the night attack on the camp of Mem II in June 1462. The historian Tursun Bey, who accompanied the Sultan on the Wallachian campaign, left a vivid description of this event. The infidels attacked suddenly, like wolves on a flock. The bravest of the Ghazis fell from their swords. The Padishah himself almost fell into the hands of the damned voivode. Later, a legend appeared that Vlad, disguised as a Turkish warrior, entered the tent of Mem II, but in the darkness, by mistake, killed not the Sultan, but his chamberlain. The Turkish chronicler Ashik Pashazade tells the story of how the Kazakli voivode invited the Ottoman ambassadors to a feast and, wanting to show his strength, ordered nails to be driven into their turbans. When the ambassadors were indignant, he said, "This is what is done to those who do not respect the customs of the host." This episode in the Turkish tradition became a symbol of the insolence and treachery of the Wallachian ruler. It is interesting that it was in Ottoman sources that the first mention of the forest of stakes, 20,000 impaled Turkish prisoners, appeared. The chronicler of Constantinople writes that even the seasoned Mem II, upon entering Targovishte, was shocked by this sight and said, "What can be done with a man who does such things?" Romanian legends. In Romanian folklore, the image of Vlad the Impaler differs strikingly from Western European and Turkish versions. Folk legends depict him as a stern but fair ruler, a defender of the common people from the tyranny of the boyars and Turkish invaders. A popular legend tells how Vlad, disguised as a simple traveler, walked around the cities and villages of his principality to find out the truth about the lives of his subjects. One day, he went into a tavern where the owner was diluting wine with water. The next day, the tavern keeper was impaled, and a sign was hung on his chest: "This is what will happen to anyone who deceives the people." Another legend tells how the ruler invited all the poor and needy to a feast in his palace. Having fed them to their fill, he asked if they wanted to get rid of the hardships of life. When they agreed, Vlad ordered the banquet hall to be set on fire. In the Romanian version, this cruel act is interpreted as an act of mercy, relieving the suffering from torment. A special place in Romanian folklore is occupied by stories about Vlad's fight against the traitor boyars. According to legend, on Easter 1459, he gathered noble boyars for a feast and asked each one how many rulers they had outlived. Those who named a large number were immediately executed for treason to the previous rulers. In folk tradition, this event is perceived as a just retribution for traitors to the homeland. To this day, in Romanian villages you can hear the saying, "If the impaler were alive, he would restore order." For many Romanians, Vlad III remains a symbol of firm power and social justice, and his cruelty is justified by state necessity in difficult historical circumstances. From history to literature. In 1897, Irish writer Bram Stoker published the novel Dracula, which forever changed the perception of the Wallachian ruler in popular culture. While working on the book, Stoker became acquainted with the history of Vlad III through the Orientalist Arminius Vambari from the University of Budapest. The author took only the name and some details of the biography from the real historical figure, creating a fundamentally new image: an aristocrat vampire. The Victorian era, with its passion for Gothic and mysticism, turned out to be the ideal time for such a transformation. Stoker skillfully combined historical facts with the vampire folklore of Eastern Europe. His Count Dracula is no longer just a cruel medieval ruler, but an immortal creature feeding on human blood. At the same time, the author retains some of the features of the real Vlad III: military valor, noble origin, connection with the Order of the Dragon. It is curious that Stoker hardly used the most famous legends about the cruelty of Vlad the Impaler. There is no forest of stakes or stories about mass executions in the novel. Instead, the writer focused on mystical elements, creating a character that is strikingly different from the historical prototype. Count Dracula in the novel says, "Blood is life," but he does not mean the bloody massacres for which the real Vlad III became famous. In the 5.5 centuries that have passed since the reign of Vlad III, his image has undergone an amazing metamorphosis. The cruel medieval ruler, who went down in history under the nickname the Impaler, has turned into one of the most influential figures in popular culture. Each era and each nation created its own Dracula. The Germans saw him as a mad tyrant, the Russians as a stern but fair ruler, the Turks as a treacherous enemy, the Romanians as a national hero, and Victorian literature turned him into an immortal vampire. This versatility of Vlad III's image makes him a unique historical character, reflecting various cultural traditions and ideas about power, justice, and evil. Perhaps it is this ability to generate new myths that makes the figure of the Wallachian ruler so attractive to each new generation. All illustrations are placed on the channel for the purpose of artistic accompaniment of the text in accordance with the imagination of the channel author. The copyright for all illustrations belongs to the owner of the channel.